Hi everyone, welcome back to Iggy's Toy Parade and Soldier Review. This is your host, Iggy. Tonight we're going to be talking about some Waterloo figures produced by Britain's Deetail. Now, Britain's Deetail was began production in 1971, and they replaced Britain's Swap It line. Now, Britain's Swappets were like the Rolls Royce of toy soldiers back in the 1960s, and many people, including my friend Doug, were very disappointed when they were replaced by Britain's Detail. However, Britain's Detail also created a fan base with many boys and girls who grew up in the 1970s. They have a nostalgic spot in their heart for Britain's Detail figures because these are the toy soldiers that their parents gave them back in the 1970s. Originally, they were produced in England, and then they were uh, began production in China until they were phased out. At which time they sold the rights to produce figures to a company in Ohio and also one in Argentina, and that happened around 2016. So they're still around, however, they're not as plentiful as they were years ago. You could go into a hobby store or a toy store, and they would have a box on the counter filled with cowboys and Indians or Eighth Army figures and German Africa Corps. It was a very exciting time if you were collecting those types of things. Now, what you see here was given to me for Christmas by my brother Robert in 1978, and he gave these to me as somewhat of a joke, which is somewhat ironic because I don't even remember the other things I got for Christmas that year, only these things. He gave them to me in a skinny 2 foot long box, and I had no idea what they were. I couldn't figure out what is this. So I opened it up and began withdrawing figures one at a time. And with each figure that saw the light of day, well, that's a weird way of saying it, but each figure that was removed from the box, I became more and more excited. I love these figures and still do to this day. They're special to me because they have somewhat of a dramatic history. At one point, I had given these to a girl that I was in love with, and she was in love with her high school sweetheart. And so Iggy couldn't compete with that. And I mailed her these figures. I don't, guys, why I did this. It's so petty and stupid. But I mailed her these figures, and I said in the letter that I want you to give these to the son I'll never have. Oh, boo hoo, Iggy. Feel sorry for you, you self pitying fool. No girl has ever fallen in love with a guy that she feels sorry for. It just has never happened. So if you're a guy and you're trying stunts and shenanigans like that, just stop it. You're never going to get anywhere. And take it from a guy who's never gotten anywhere. Don't do it. Anyway, she did mail them back to me. I felt vaguely embarrassed about what I had done, but was delighted to see the figures again. And just 1 year later, I met this other girl named Tara, and she said, "This is ridiculous." And because I had them on my bookshelf, and she said, "These are for little boys. You're not a little boy. Grow up." And I said, "Well, I enjoy collecting these. I like them. I don't understand what the problem is. They're for little kids, not for men. Either they go or I go." And so in front of her, I threw them in the trash, and she left satisfied with a smirk on her face that she had triumphed. And 4 years later, We're divorced. However, I still had these figures because after she left, I took them out of the trash and I hid them. And boy, am I glad I did, because she's no longer part of my life. I haven't even seen her in 30 years, but look what I still have, guys. And I would much rather have these. Now, that sounds kind of shallow and mean spirited to say, but Tara and I were not meant to be together. We just were totally unsuited for each other. Oh, I thought I turned it off there for a second, but I'm still here. Okay, now what do these figures represent? Well, this is the British at the Battle of Waterloo. And what you see in the top is three horsemen representing the Scots Greys. Now, if you've seen there's a painting by Lady Butler done in 1881 that shows the charge of the Scots Greys at Waterloo. My God, that's an exciting painting. If you haven't seen it, I suggest that you look it up on YouTube or Google or whatever it is, because it's a very exciting painting, very dramatic, and it's just a great painting. I love it. It's one of my favorites. Um, there was 400 cavalrymen in the Scots Greys at Waterloo, and in conjunction with the efforts of the Gordon Highlanders, they repelled attack after attack by the French. And they did that long enough for the Prussians to arrive on the battle scene. And between the Prussians and the British, they were able to um, defeat the French at Waterloo. And that would turn out to be Napoleon's last battle. When he was in exile, he wrote that he had won. I can't remember how many battles he said he won, but something like, I've won over 100 battles, and the only one I'm remembered for is the one I lost. So Napoleon was quite aware of the significance of the battle. There's still a controversy of whether or not Napoleon died a natural death or if he was poisoned. But he was in exile for, I believe, 6 years, and then he had died, and they think that he was poisoned. Years later, the French brought his body back to France, and they entombed it in Paris. And to this day, you can go and look at the final resting place of Napoleon. So that was kind of exciting. So these figures here, I don't know what's going on with my voice. I don't smoke, by the way. I don't smoke or drink. Yes, Iggy is very boring. These represent the English infantrymen at the Battle of Waterloo, but they would also have been the same uniforms worn by the British in Spain when they were fighting against King Joseph, who was Napoleon's older brother and was installed on the throne of Spain by Napoleon with the backing of the French army. And the Spanish attacked through Portugal and slowly pushed the French out of Spain. And that's where Wellington gained his reputation. Well, actually, Wellington gained somewhat of a reputation in India first, and then it was solidified when he was in Portugal and Spain. And then with the Battle of Waterloo, he, of course, became quite famous. At the Battle of Bladensburg in Maryland during the War of 1812, or some people call it the Second War of Independence, these troops repelled the American militia. They virtually shoved them away effortlessly and advanced on Washington, D.C., where they torched the Capitol and the White House. And they did the Americans a big favor by destroying their capital. Now, some people say, why did they do that? That's barbaric. And I said, well, it actually was revenge for what the Americans had done in Canada, because the Americans had marched on York, which was near Buffalo, I believe, and they burned the Canadian capital. At that time, Canada's capital was in York. Okay. Um, the British almost succeeded in that war because they were marching on Baltimore, and their general, who I think his name was Ross, General Ross, was quite capable, a very good and energetic general, very well liked by his troops. And he was shot and killed by an American sniper, a teenager who was hiding in a tree, and he shot Ross dead. And the British attack lost momentum as a result of that loss, and the attack petered out. And of course, the British fleet bombarding Fort McHenry also was unsuccessful, and so the British ended up withdrawing. And the war had ended when the Battle of New Orleans had taken place, but they had not received word of that treaty until after the battle. But that battle pretty much cemented the pretty much carved in stone the results of the war, I guess. So these guys over here, I believe, represent Gordon Highlanders, although you cannot tell from the kilt because each Scottish regiment wore a tartan, I guess that's what they call it, which was very distinctive and separated the different clans. And what I mentioned, I think, a few minutes ago, that the attack of the Scots Greys and the Gordon Highlanders repelled the multiple French attacks until the Prussians showed up on the flank of the French, and the French knew that the gig was up at that point. I like this flag carrier. He's a great pose. There is something that's kind of fun to note is that the last recognized veteran of the Battle of Waterloo was a officer. I can't remember if he was a lieutenant or a lieutenant colonel, but he died in 1891, and he was 96 years old, something to that effect. So he was a geezer, but a long lived. He's had a very long life and a very interesting life, as you can imagine. So these figures, given to me as a joke, survived being thrown in a trash can and survived being shipped off to someone. And fortunately for me, they were returned and then later hidden so that I could still enjoy them to this day. I want to thank you for coming along. For those of you that have joined the Iggy Army, thank you very much. And thank you for getting Iggy with it. It's time for me to hit the dusty trail. So I'm going to say so long and so long, goodbye, Feeders. I don't know how that song goes now. I used to have a crush on Julie Andrews. I guess every boy did back in those days. She has a beautiful voice. Oh my goodness. It's like an angel's voice. What was I saying? Oh, I was saying goodbye. How does it go, guys? Is it so long, farewell, auf Wiedersehen, good night? Something like that. I don't remember. Anyway, if you know what, I should give you guys $1 every time I say anyway and So if you guys had $1 for each of those, you could retire in wealth and hopefully health. So let's hit the dusty trail. We'll meet up at Roy Rogers Ranch. Make sure you bring a carrot for Trigger and a biscuit for Bullet. And I want to say thank you and good night.